Hello everyone, this is Corsair Mack from Mack's Empowerment Counseling LLC, and today we're going to be going over cognitive distortions and how to help out with them. So sit back, relax, take everything I say with a grain of salt, do your own research, and enjoy the video. Alright, so the cognitive distortions we'll be going over today are all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, mental filters, discounting the positive, jumping to conclusions, magnification, emotional resonating, should statements, labeling, and personalization and blame. And again, thank you very much to Very Well Mind for letting me use their content. And also, link to this will be in the description as well. Alright, so let's see what they say about all or nothing thinking. Alright, all or nothing thinking is also known as black and white thinking or polarized thinking. This type of thinking involves viewing things in absolute terms. Solutions are always black or white, everything or nothing, good or bad, success or failure. And then, of course, they give an example down here. Go ahead and read it if you want. Alright, so the problem with this type of thinking is that it doesn't allow any room to acknowledge anything between the two extremes. It can impair your motivation and confidence and make it make it harder to stick to long-term goals. All right, and then here's how CBT helps to overcome it. So CBT works to overcome this type of cognitive distortion by helping you recognize that success and progress are not all or nothing concepts. By addressing this type of thinking and replacing self-defeating thoughts, you can feel better about your progress and recognize your strengths. So basically, like the article said, all or nothing thinking means it has to be either this way or that way. There can be no in between. Right, so with all or nothing thinking, the way to help combat that, right, is by allowing that wiggle room. So, for example, like I mentioned in my anxiety video, the main enemy of anxiety is facts, or what is 100% to be true. Right, so you can take the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, mush it together, plop it down, and get the most likely case that's going to happen, right? Finding that gray area and saying, well, it's not going to be all bad or all good, but it's going to be a little bit of in between really helps expand your thought process to get rid of that all or nothing thinking. So by doing that, first we got to challenge our thoughts by saying, is what I'm thinking 100% true? Is there any way that I can disprove that? If there is, then ultimately we got to take in all matters into consideration. So that way it's not just that black or white, but then there's that gray in between. That's a possibility as well. So by identifying that gray, right, we normally just combine the black or white. Right? So ultimately, for example, if you're going into an exam, you're like, either I am going to get a 100% on this or I'm going to get a 0% on this, right? There can be no in between. But there's a possibility you could get a 90% or an 80% or a 70% or a 73% or an 84% or 95%. Right? By doing that, we're challenging that thought process to say, okay, I'm not going to either pass or fail. Right? Ultimately, I can get anywhere in between that. Right? So that's how you overcome all or nothing thinking. Next up is overgeneralization. So overgeneralization happens when you make a rule after a single event or series of coincidence. The word always or never frequently appear in the sentence because you have experience with one event playing out a certain way. You assume that all future events will have the same outcome. Of course, they give the example here. You can read that if you want. Alright, so the problem with this type of thinking is that it doesn't account for differences between situations as well as the role that chance or luck can play. This thinking can have a number of consequences on how people think and act in different situations. Overgeneralization is associated with the development and maintenance of different anxiety disorders. When people have a bad experience in one situation, they assume that the same thing will happen again in the future. Right, so I'll leave it on the example there. So basically, right, with overgeneralization, exactly as how it sounds. Right, in one situation, one thing happens, whether good or bad. Most of the time when it's bad, people generalize that situation to any future situations that may have that same effect or involve the same circumstances. Right, so I believe I gave this example before, but right, let's say you go over someone's house and you meet their pet. right? Let's say that pet scratches you with their claws, right? So you have a bad situation there. So every time you go over to their house, you're going to assume, oh, that pet is going to scratch me with their claws again. Ultimately, we got to remember, just like with all or nothing thinking, there are also different possibilities that can happen. So that way we don't overgeneralize, right? Maybe that pet wasn't used to you, right? Maybe now that pet is getting used to you, so it's less likely to scratch you and more likely to let you pet them or anything like that, right? When we just apply one instance to an entire situation as well as entire future situations, that doesn't allow for growth and development to see all the different possibilities that could come with that. So ultimately, that's how you overcome overgeneralization by saying, okay, this situation happened this way this time, though for future situations, here's how it could happen differently, here's how it could happen differently, whether good or bad. Right? And ultimately, that's how you overcome all overgeneralization. Right? Again, with applying all different aspects of saying, if it happened once in this situation, it's going to happen the same way in future situations. All right, next is mental filters. So a mental filter is an opposite of overgeneralization, but with the same negative outcome. Instead of taking one small event and generalizing it inappropriately, the mental filter takes one small event and focuses on it exclusively, filtering out anything else. So, this type of cognitive distortion can contribute to problems including addiction, anxiety, poor self belief, and interpersonal problems, amongst other things. All right, and then there's the example there. All right, so filtering out the positive and focusing on the negative can have a detrimental impact on your mental well-being. Sorry, on your mental well-being. One study found that when people focus only on negative self-beliefs, it contributes to feelings of hopelessness and increase the risk of suicidal thinking. All right, so basically, this is exactly how it sounds like. In our heads, we're only looking for one specific thing. And generally, when it comes to cognitive distortion, that thing is negative, right? So it could be in relationships that we have, whether it's with our family, significant others, friends, coworkers. It could be in different things that we do, whether it's with work, exercise, any other activities that we partake in, or anything else, right? Because ultimately, that mental filter is going to keep out certain things and only have you pay attention to negative things, right? So ultimately, when we do that, right, we ultimately have to overcome that by opening that mental filter, right? Again, when it comes to anxiety, we got to focus on the facts, what is 100% true. For example, in relationships, sure, they might have said this negative thing about you, but then you're also missing out on the positive things that they said about you as well, right? Or true, this bad thing happened, but you're also ignoring all the good things that happened also, right? We can't just be looking out for negative things because ultimately, when that negative thing comes along, we're going to be so fixated on it that we're going to miss all the positive things that happen as well, right? So, to help overcome mental filters, set that filter, look for any neutral or positive things that can happen to you in any of those certain circumstances. And that way, you'll open your mind up to a different way of thinking, and by not just looking out for negatives, but looking out for neutral instances and positive instances as well. So that's how you overcome mental filters. All right, next, discounting the positives. So, discounting the positive is a cognitive distortion that involves ignoring or invalidating good things that have happened to you. It is similar to mental filtering, but instead of simply ignoring the positives, you are actively rejecting them. All right, then he gives the example right there. All right, when people use this cognitive distortion, they view positive events as flukes because these positives are always seen as anomalies. They don't expect them to happen again in the future. The problem with this type of thinking is that it undermines your faith in your abilities rather than recognizing your strengths. You assume that you aren't competent or skilled, you just got lucky. All right. So basically, discounting the positives, exactly how it sounds like, you're actively rejecting all the positive things that are happening to you. Right, and just like with mental filters, right, you're actively filtering out. So basically, yes, you're ignoring it by just keeping it behind your filter and you're only filtering the negatives. But this one, you're basically saying any positive thing that happened to me is a fluke, coincidence, or anything like that, right? Or the positive thing shouldn't have happened to me. It should have been this negative thing, right? So ultimately, you could do 100 things correctly. Though, if you do that one thing wrong, your mind focuses on that and saying, oh, all those 100 things you did correctly were just flukes. They were accidents. So ultimately, to overcome that, we have to, one, have more confidence in ourselves. Because ultimately, if a positive thing happens, 9 times out of 10, it's not a fluke. True that 1 time out of 10 it could have possibly been a fluke, but 9 times out of 10 it wasn't. That positive thing happened because of you and all of the success that you've accumulated up to this point and beyond. Right? So recognizing that, yes, I have the skills for this, right? Overcoming that imposter syndrome. Yes, I have confidence in my abilities, and showing that, yes, when I focus on the facts of the situation, I did A, B, C, and X, Y, and Z to land me in that positive light, right? To land me in that positive outcome. So ultimately, that is how you overcome discounting the positives. All right, next is jumping to conclusions. There are two ways of jumping to conclusions. First is mind reading. When you think someone is going to react in a particular way, you just believe that someone is thinking things that they aren't. And fortune telling, when you predict events, will unfold in a particular way, often to avoid trying something difficult. Right, and it gives examples of that. All right, so it doesn't have anything else. So basically, jumping to conclusions, right? When it comes to mind reading, right, you see the person, you figure if I go up there, they're going to automatically think a certain way. Based off of that, they're going to act a certain way. So there's no point in me really engaging with that person. Or fortune telling, right? Ultimately, it's if I attempt to do this, I could just see how bad it's going to turn out. Or if I attempt to do that, all these things are going to go wrong. And then that just stops you from attempting that activity in the first place. So ultimately, to overcome that, we got to really, again, right, focus on the facts of the situation. What is 100% true? If you see a person you believe, oh, they're going to act a certain way, ask yourself, is that 100% true? Right? Have they acted that way to me in the past? If so, right, what happened in the past? How much time has passed? Did that person grow and develop? Did I grow and develop? Am I going to even be talking about the same subject as I did in the past? Right, things like that to help disprove that, to give you the confidence and self esteem to go engage with that person in conversation. Same thing with the activity, right? For fortune telling, again, focus on the facts. Did I attempt this already in the past? If so, what went wrong? How did that go wrong? Now that I see how it went wrong, can I do something to actively change it for it to go better? And ultimately, we do that, we get that sense of confidence and self esteem to attempt that project. So that is how we overcome jumping to conclusions. Next is magnification. Magnification is exaggerating the importance of shortcomings and problems while minimizing the importance of desirable qualities. Similar to mental filtering and discounting the positive, this cognitive distortion involves magnifying your negative qualities while minimizing your positive ones. Right? And then when something bad happens, you see this as proof of your own failures. But when good things happen, you minimize their importance. And then it gives an example there. Right? So this thinking can affect behavior in a variety of ways. It can contribute to feelings of anxiety, fear, and panic because it causes people to exaggerate the importance of insignificant problems. People sometimes believe that other people notice and judge even small mistakes. At the same time, they will minimize their own ability to cope with feelings of stress and anxiety, which can then contribute to increased anxiety and avoidance. Right? So ultimately, when it comes to magnification, just like it mentions, you focus so much on the negative stuff and you don't focus enough on the positive stuff. Right? So that way, when something does happen, you just focus on, oh man, I did this bad thing, or oh man, this bad thing about me made this happen. And you minimize all of the positive qualities about yourself, or all the good things that you've done. Right? So to help out with that, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but we got to focus on the facts, what is 100% true. Acknowledge what you did, whether good or bad, and see how those things really help play out into the outcome of the situation. Right? Because ultimately, we don't give ourselves enough credit. Right? We should give ourselves more credit. Though, when it comes to magnification, we give credit to our negative qualities and attributes, right? And then we see that, oh man, everybody saw that, or oh man, everybody's going to think this, or oh man, everybody's going to notice that. When in reality, they're probably focused on their own things, trying to make sure they don't mess up or anything like that, right? So ultimately, to help out with it, again, focus on the facts, take a look at the whole situation, take a look at how you contributed both positively and negatively, and that'll help you with magnification. All right, next is emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is a way of judging yourself or your circumstances based on your emotions. For instance, Jenna used emotional reasoning to conclude that she was a worthless person, which in turn led to binge eating. Alright, this type of reasoning assumes that because you are experiencing a negative emotion, it must be an accurate reflection of reality. If you experience feelings of guilt, for example, emotional reasoning will lead you to conclude that you are a bad person. This type of thinking can contribute to a number of problems, including feelings of anxiety and depression. While research has found that this distortion is common in people who have anxiety and depression, is actually a very common way of thinking that many people engage in. Right? Again, cognitive behavior therapy can help people learn to recognize the signs of emotional reasoning and realize that feelings are not facts. All right, so for this one, basically, just like what the article said, whatever you're feeling, you're using that to justify any negative thing about yourself. Right? Whether it is feelings of guilt, shame, hopelessness, or worthlessness, you're taking those feelings and saying, because I'm feeling this emotion, I'm a bad person. Right? So to help to overcome that, right, just like the article mentioned, just like what I've been saying, we got to really take a look at the facts of the situation. Right? What's 100% true? Just because I'm feeling hopeless, worthless, or guilty, does that mean that whatever happened is my fault? Right? Or are we just internalizing that and blaming ourselves over nothing? Right? And also, why don't we take a look at why aren't we thinking of positive emotions? Right? Why can't we focus on positive things or positive qualities about ourselves? And if we are really focused on the negatives, why can't we change that about ourselves to make it more neutral or positive? Right? Ultimately, when we take emotional reasoning in, we take a look at those feelings are facts about ourselves. When ultimately, it's helping us ignore the actual facts, really taking a look to see, why am I feeling this in the first place, working through that and overcoming that. Right? So ultimately, that's how we help with emotional reasoning. Recognizing the emotional reasoning, really taking a look to see why I'm feeling that way and working through that. Next are should statements. Should statements involve always thinking about things that you think you should or must do. These types of statements can make you feel worried or anxious. Right? They can also cause you to experience feelings of guilt or a sense of failure because you always think you should be doing something. You end up feeling as if you are always failing. Right? And then these statements are self-defeating ways we talk to ourselves that emphasize unattainable standards. Then, when we fall short of our own ideas, we fail in our own eyes, which can create panic and anxiety. All right, and then they give that example there. Right, but ultimately, when it comes to should statements, they always come with should have done this, I could have done that, I ought to do that. Right? We're shoulding ourselves, right, when we should not be. So ultimately, to overcome those things, we gotta again take a look at the facts of the situation and what's 100% true, and really say, should I really be doing this? Or if we're taking a look at things in the past, right, I should have done this, I should have done that, I could have done this, I could have done that, or I would have done this, I would have done that if I recognized A, B, C, X, Y, or Z. Again, we're doing that self defeating. So ultimately, we got to stay in the present, in the here and now. Whatever happened in the past happened. There's nothing we can do to change that. Though there are things we can do now in the present as well as in the future to help alter that if we need to. So instead of saying, man, I should have done this in the past, say, if that situation comes up in the future, I am going to do this. Or if we're taking a look at anything else like that, right? Focus on the facts. Recognize what went wrong in that situation. So that way, if you recognize you're coming into that situation in the future, right, you can plan ahead. So that way, boom, there will be no more shoulds, woulds, or coulds. There will be, I am doing this. All right, next is labeling. So, labeling is a cognitive distortion that involves making a judgment about yourself or someone else as a person rather than seeing the behavior as something the person did that does not define them as an individual. You might think of this cognitive distortion as an extreme type of all or nothing thinking because it involves attaching a label to someone that offers no room for anything outside of that narrow restrictive box. Right? And then it gives that example there. All right. So basically what labeling is stereotyping, right? You are putting a label on someone based off of what they look like, how they act, what they do, right? So on and so forth. And you can't separate that label from other people or that person, allowing them to say, okay, maybe they were having a bad day today, or maybe they were just feeling A, B, C, X, Y, and Z, or maybe they just act that way around a certain person and then all the other times they weren't, right? So ultimately, to get rid of labeling, right, again, focus on the facts. Just because they acted this certain way, does that mean that that is them 100%, right? How do they act in other situations, right? Do they act that certain way or do they act differently, right? Ultimately, what we're doing, we're taking that label off of that person, right? And we're spending time with them, learning more about them, understanding them to see, okay, maybe I had this wrong. This is who that person truly is, instead of just making a judgment based off of one thing. So ultimately, that's how you overcome labeling. And then lastly, personalization and blame. So personalization and blame is a cognitive distortion whereby you entirely blame yourself or someone else for a situation that in reality involved many factors that were out of your control. All right, and then there's the example there. All right, so personalization and blame cause people to feel inadequate. It can also leave people experiencing feelings of shame and guilt. Blame can also be attributed to others. In some cases, people will blame other people while ignoring other factors that could potentially play a role in the situation. Right? Then they gave an example there. But basic personalization and blaming, exactly how it sounds, right? We either personalize it to ourselves or someone else and we blame. Right? So ultimately, that could be us saying it's our fault that the dog didn't get any food, right? When ultimately it might not have been your day to feed the dog in the first place, right? And that person might not have gotten around to feed the dog because of A, B, C, X, Y, and Z, right? Because ultimately we're personalizing that on ourselves and we're blaming ourselves for it when in reality there's a whole bunch of different factors that contributed to that in the first place, right? And to ultimately understand and overcome that, again, we got to focus on the facts. What's 100% true, right? If it wasn't our turn to feed the dog, we can easily go to that person whose turn it was and say, hey, what happened? And what can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? So that way that person can reach out to somebody or, they could buy like one of those time feeders. So that way at a specific time, the feeder lets out food for the dog or what have you. Right, but that's how you overcome personalization and blame by recognizing that it's not just this one thing, but it could have been a whole bunch of other factors that we're not really thinking of those potential factors and working through them to come to a resolution. All right, so then I will share my final thoughts in a second. All right, so my final thoughts are basically cognitive distortions are things that help trip people up in their mind, right? Though ultimately, just like what I mentioned, if we take a look at the facts of the situation or we see what's 100% true, we can easily overcome that. Because ultimately, with those cognitive distortions, they add on a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, and a lot of negativity that you do not need in your life, right? And that stress, pressure, negativity is basically unwanted. So ultimately, by thinking about the facts, recognizing, hey, I'm anxious, here's what I'm anxious about, or hey, I have this thought, and here's why I'm thinking that, we can work through that and overcome that. right? Because when it comes to depression, anxiety, or anything like that, I'll never tell you to not feel those emotions, right? It's important to feel them because that helps us recognize what we're reacting to. Then, based off of that, right, we use coping skills. If you take medication for it, you can use medication to get to a level to where we can deal with the situation. Ultimately, that's what we need to be doing. All right, so other than that, that's about it. Thank you guys very much for watching. All right, and again, if you are interested in making an appointment with me, if you live in the Illinois state, feel free to visit my website, mackec.com, to learn more. All right, thank you guys very much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.